1 Corinthians 15. Where we have been, I know we were interrupted for a good reason last week. That was with the baptism lesson. But prior to that, we had been looking at the believer's resurrection. And we had asked these several questions over the past several weeks, just taking a sort of a high-level view of the resurrection. And we're getting ready to finish that up. We started a couple weeks ago asking, well, what will it be like? What will it be like? We've been sort of examining that final question. It's natural that would be our main focus. Most of us, when we're about to experience something entirely new, we always want to know what we can expect. And that's what we started looking at last time. And there's good news, of course, where our resurrection is concerned. There's a lot of information in the Bible about that. So we've already seen sort of the mechanics of it, the experience of it. What will it be like? Remember, we said it would start very suddenly. That Christ is going to appear with a great shout, and that our resurrection would start very suddenly. It will be unexpected by the rest of the world, those who walk in darkness. But considering we are not those people, it shouldn't take us by surprise. We should be looking forward to it. We should be expecting it. At any rate, it's going to start very suddenly, and then remember, it will happen instantly. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, the dead in Christ will be raised, and we who are alive and remain will be changed instantly. It won't be a long, drawn-out process. It will start suddenly. It will happen instantly. It'll be orderly. The dead in Christ will go first, and those who are alive and remain will follow them and be changed into the likeness of Christ. And it will be final in that's it. Once we are raised from the dead, we will dwell with God forever. We will be made into the image of Christ finally, and our salvation will be finished. That's our what the Scripture calls our glorification, the end of our salvation process. Now, part of what we mean when we ask what will it be like is usually have something more specific in mind. And that is, what will I be like? In other words, what will this new body that I'm going to get be like? What's it going to be capable of? How's it going to be different from the body I have now? Am I going to have superpowers? Will I be able to fly or turn invisible? Well, the Bible doesn't answer that. I'm going to say no, but the Bible doesn't answer that. Most of us will probably just be content to be able to get up again if you ever get down on the floor for some reason. And other things like that. Will we be able to eat anything we want and still not gain weight? Am I going to go into the grave looking like this, but come out looking like, Tom Cruise? No, you're not. And we'll get into that probably next week. But there's a lot of information in here about what we can expect in these new bodies, and there's some really cool stuff about it found right here in 1 Corinthians 15. And so what we'll do today is I want to go through this passage in 1 Corinthians 15 a little bit and talk about the coming body that we can all expect to receive. And then next week, Lord's will, what we'll do is we'll take various passages, selected scriptures, because we actually have an example of what one of these new bodies are like, what they're capable of. And we'll look at that probably next week. But Paul explains a great deal about these new bodies we can expect to receive in 1 Corinthians 15. In fact, he explains the more important stuff than the silly questions I was asking. And we see that in this passage beginning in verse 35. So, now, what I want to say is, before we start going through this passage, is this explanation Paul is about to give actually starts with a seemingly good question. A seemingly good question. In verse 35, you see Paul repeat the question that someone had asked, but someone will say, how are the dead raised up? And with what body do they come? Paul's response in verse 36 is, you fool. Now, does that seem strange? Does it seem strange? There's this seemingly good question in verse 35. Seems legit. How are the dead raised up? What kind of, with what kind of body will they come forth? And then Paul's answer seems like this sort of unkind outburst. You fool! You wouldn't think Paul would react that way to somebody asking a question about the resurrection. And so one of the things before we start into this we need to understand is why does he answer harshly this seemingly good, it's actually two questions about the resurrection. Well, the reason is because they weren't really asking a good question. If you go back in this same chapter, 1 Corinthians 15 to verse 12, let me show you what I mean. This entire chapter is about the resurrection. First, it's about Christ's resurrection, and then it changes into what we can expect in our resurrection. What he says in verse 12, actually 12, 13, and 14 is this. If Christ has been preached that he's been raised from the dead, how are some of you saying there is no resurrection from the dead? If there's no resurrection from the dead, then Christ is not risen. And if Christ is not risen, our preaching is empty, and your faith is also empty. You see this question over here, how are the dead raised, and with what body do they come from? It wasn't really a good question. Some of the people in the Corinthian church, having been influenced by who knows who, were going around asking this question about the resurrection in a really demeaning, derisive, kind of an attack sort of way. And I know that you get this because we do it to one another all the time. If someone comes to you with an idea they have, or maybe a plan they have, or something they believe, you ask something like, oh, really? And how are you going to do that? So you don't really want to know when you ask that. You're just attacking me. And that's what this question was about that Paul is trying to address here. It was a question designed to embarrass someone or to cause them to question their own faith. Technically, there are two questions in verse 35. How are the dead raised up? And it would have sounded like this. In the Corinthian church, you would have gone to someone and said, oh, I can't wait for their resurrection. And they would have said, oh, really? Well, just exactly how are the dead going to be raised up? How's that going to work? That was the tone behind the question. They're not asking about the mechanics. They're asking about the plausibility. And then he says they asked, and with what kind of body do they come from? You see, the objection here to the resurrection, as we look back a moment ago in verses 12, 13, and 14, Paul said, I have preached to you that Christ has been raised from the dead, and some of y'all are going around saying there will be no resurrection from the dead. So you had a lot of people in the Corinthian church who didn't believe there was going to be a resurrection. And when you brought it up, oh, brother, we're going to be raised from the dead, they would start attacking you with a bunch of dumb questions designed to embarrass you, not to get information. And those are the questions to which Paul is responding in our passage. And so they ask these questions, how are the dead raised up, and with what kind of body will they come? Their sort of unbelief here is based on being short-sighted. Paul says in verse 36, you fools. That's what it says in the original language. You fools. And so you may have a Bible version that says something that's all right. But Paul's response is, you fools. That Greek word is the word aphron, and that means a stupid, ignorant person because they are egotistical. That's a good way to put it. And so what you have here is this. You have some people who had claimed to believe the gospel. We see that already in the other verses, back 12, 13, 14. They believed that Jesus, or they said they believed Jesus had been raised from the dead, but they did not believe we would be raised from the dead. And the reason they didn't believe it is because they couldn't see any way God could make that happen. The idea was they had come to a wrong conclusion based on a wrong premise. These people who opposed the resurrection of the dead in the Corinthian church, they didn't see how God was going to be able to overcome death. They didn't see how we could put a body in the ground and it could rot away, and then God would be able to raise a body. And because they couldn't understand these things, they just came to the conclusion, well, there's not going to be a resurrection because this is ridiculous. You can't put one body in the ground and a body come out. You can't die and then be made alive. And so that's sort of the angle they're coming from here. And so you see Paul's sort of aggravation when he answers them in verse 36, you fools, you fools. They weren't trying to get answers to questions. They were just trying to support their own denial of the gospel. But in response, Paul explains the answers to their questions anyway. And he does it through an illustration beginning in verse 36. Look at what he says here. You fools, what you sow is not made alive unless it dies. And what you sow, you do not sow the body that will be, but mere grain, perhaps wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as He pleases, and to each seed its own body. All flesh is not the same flesh. There's one kind of flesh of men, another kind of flesh of animals, another of fish, another of birds. Beyond that, he says in verse 40, there are also celestial bodies and terrestrial bodies. The glory of the celestial is one, the glory of the terrestrial is another, the glory of the sun, there's a glory of the moon, there's a glory of the stars. In fact, each star is different from one another. Verse 42, so also is the resurrection of the dead. To answer their question, Paul uses an illustration from nature. Actually, he uses three. But it's illustrations we can all understand. Even people who don't believe the gospel have to agree to what he says about all of this stuff that he brings up in nature. Notice what he says to begin with. He says, you fools, don't you understand that what you plant doesn't come to life unless it dies first? Now, I would say everybody in this room in particular probably understands the concept of gardening, at least on some level. Most of us have extensive gardens of some type at home. And we all understand that the way this works is we go out there and we plant the seed, and we care for it in the ways we need to care for it. And if everything goes well, a plant comes up and we eventually harvest from it. Paul's first response is this: don't you understand the concept that what you plant doesn't come to life until it dies first? Are those of you avid gardeners out there aware that a seed, right? A seed, the thing we plant in the ground, is actually just a husk. What we call the seed is not really the seed. It's just what covers the seed. A seed, if you remember back to junior high science class, is composed of three different parts. There's the husk that we plant, and then inside of it, there's an embryo, and I forget what the third thing is called, an endosperm, I think. And that's what comes to life. And so what happens when we plant a seed in the ground, what we're calling the seed, that outer part, it rots away because it wasn't the life of the plant. It was just what the life was kept in. Very much like the bodies we inhabit right now, aren't they? Right? I'm not the person you are seeing when you look at me. This is just what I'm kept in. Very much like a seed. And Paul says, you instinctively understand that nothing comes to life if it doesn't die first. Because the husk that it's kept in has to rot away in order for life to come out of it. And because that's true with seeds, it's also true with our natural human bodies. And so the first thing Paul says is, how can you not understand how resurrection could happen? Unless death occurs, life cannot come from it. He goes on to say in verse 37 that what comes alive is nothing like the thing that dies. Look at what he says in verse 37. What you sow, you don't sow the body that will be, you just sow grain. We understand this too, don't we? When we go out and we plant, let's say, a tomato seed in the ground, we don't wait 3 months and then all of a sudden a tomato seed pops up on top of the ground and we take it and eat it. It's not the way it works. The thing we plant is nothing like the thing that we harvest, is it? We plant this tiny little dried up, sort of useless, seemingly useless thing. We put it in the ground, cover it up, and we let it die, and then something entirely different comes out. The thing that comes out of the ground was nothing like the thing we put into the ground. It was completely different in every way. It doesn't look like it. It doesn't behave like it. It doesn't have its same requirements. It doesn't have the same needs. The thing that comes out of the ground is very different than the thing that goes into the ground. He goes on to say in verse 38, and it's for this reason that God gives things any kind of body He wants. That God gives it a body as He pleases, and to each seed its own body. In other words, God gives to everything that exists the kind of body He wants it to have. He illustrates that beginning in verse 39. He says, "Consider this, all flesh is not the same. There's one kind of flesh of men, another of animals, another of fish, another of birds." We see this being true every single day in our world, don't we? We are flesh and blood. Dogs are flesh and blood. But they're nothing like who we are, right? Fish are flesh and blood. But they're nothing like we are. Birds. It goes on and on and on, right? That we can already see that all flesh is not the same. So he's laying out these principles that we can see at work in the world every day, and we readily accept these things. We just inherently understand there are different kinds of bodies. And the bodies that go in the ground aren't the same as the bodies that come out of the ground. These are just universal principles nobody can deny. He goes on to say, in fact, down verse 39, 40, 41, he says, beyond even these bodies on the earth that are made out of flesh, he says there are other kind of bodies in the universe. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. The sun is different from the moon. It's different from the stars. He says, and the stars are different from each other. There are all these differences, and God has given a body to everything the way He wants it to have. And so you end up, after reading all that, with sort of three thoughts. Here's the point to Paul's opponents. You live in a universe right now in which there are certain undeniable truths that are in operation every day, and you're willing to accept them. And here's what they are. Number one, new life comes forth from death. Number two, the life that comes forth from death looks nothing like what was put into the ground, right? It's entirely different in its nature. What comes out of the ground is different from what existed before. And number three, physical bodies take different forms. And so what Paul is saying there is, so you see and accept and even count on principles every day that will be involved in the resurrection. Why is it so hard to believe that if God can give different kinds of bodies to everything that exists now, why couldn't He give a different kind of body to people who come alive from the dead? You see, their denial was based on a perceived problem that God couldn't overcome death, and this is what Paul is trying to correct. And so, having used an illustration to explain what our bodies will be like, he now moves on to sort of how that applies in our remaining verses. So he has said so far, here's what you can expect when you come back alive from the dead. The body that was put into the ground will be nothing like the body that comes out. Now, as we'll see next week, it'll be like it in some ways, but its essence will be very different. And he explains what that difference is beginning in verse 42. Look what he says. In this way, that is the way he's already explained, so also is the resurrection from the dead. The body is sown in corruption, it's raised in incorruption. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. It's sown in weakness, it's raised in power. It is sown, and here's the distinction, it is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. That's his point. You see, Paul's opponents couldn't imagine someone going into the grave and then coming out again at all, because they couldn't conceive of God's ability to take one thing and recreate it into an entirely different thing. And what Paul says here is the distinct difference between the body we inhabit now and the one that's going to come out of the grave is one is a natural body, the other is a spiritual body. One is a physical body, the other is a spiritual body. Look how Paul begins here. He says, in the same way in verse 42, so is the resurrection from the dead. In other words, the same principles that apply to the universe that I've just discussed also apply to the resurrection from the dead. And he says, look how these apply in verse 42. So is the body is sown in corruption, it's raised in incorruption. It's sown in dishonor, it's raised in glory. Just like the seed. The thing that is planted in the grave is not the same thing that comes back. Just like the seed that we plant is not what comes up and is harvested, the body that's planted in the grave is not going to be what comes out of the grave. It's not sort of a reformed, or it's not a remodel, in other words. It's an entirely new thing. Just like when we plant a seed, what we harvest isn't what we planted. When we're raised from the dead, what will be raised is not what was planted. It will be, as Paul says, a spiritual body. It was a body that was sown natural, raised spiritual, sown weak, raised powerful, sown corruptible, raised incorruptible. The body that you will inhabit for eternity is nothing like the body you inhabit now. It will not be subject to disease. It will not be subject to decay. It will not be subject to old age. That's what he means when he says it is sown in corruption. It is raised in incorruption. In verse 43 he says it is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. The body you are going to inhabit is susceptible to sin. It's susceptible to temptation. The body you will inhabit will not be. We will not only will we not have the same physical problems that we have now and the same sort of problems associated with this world, we won't have problems associated with the fallenness of this world. We won't suffer temptation. We won't be tempted and drawn toward things that are ungodly, because it was sown in dishonor, but it will be raised in glory. The bodies that we're going to inhabit, he says in verse 40 or verse 43, are sown in weakness, but they will be raised in power. That's another reference to the moral condition. Right now we are weak. The Scripture says that Jesus said our flesh is weak. The Spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. It sort of wavers back and forth all the time. It wants to give in to the powers of temptation. That's not going to be true in your resurrected state. You're not going to have to be worried about any of that stuff, because it was sown in weakness, but it will be raised instead in power. Most of all, as I mentioned, he says, it is sown natural, it is raised spiritual. That is the distinct kind of difference. He goes on to explain, beginning in, verse 45. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, that is Christ, became a life-giving spirit. The spiritual is not the first, but the natural, and afterward the spiritual. He says the first man, that is Adam, was of the earth, made of dust. The second man is of the Lord, made from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are made of dust, and as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are heavenly. What Paul is saying here is the distinct difference between what we have now and what we are going to inherit is one is completely tied to the earth, and the other will be completely tied to heaven. One is completely tied to the natural world. The other will be completely tied to the spiritual world. You see, right now we are created, we exist in the image of our one father, Adam, don't we? And I don't mean not just his physical image. We all have arms and legs and hair and eyes, right? Just like Adam did. We exist in his spiritual image as well. We exist in his fallenness. We exist in his weakness. We exist in his proclivity to disobey. We exist in his inability to do the right thing, right? All of these things that come attached with being in that natural body, that natural man, that first man. But Paul says here there was a second man. There was a second Adam. I love how he refers to Christ in this passage in that way. There was another Adam. There was another first man. And this man was not of the earth. He didn't come from the earth. And he wasn't tied to the earth. And he wasn't subject to its powers. And he wasn't subject to its providence, right? This second Adam, he was all spiritual. And he came from heaven. That was his origin. It wasn't the dust like the first Adam. And those who are made in the image of the second Adam, they have everything the second Adam has. And we've studied this extensively too, how the Bible uses language that we're to be conformed to the image of Christ when we're raised from the dead. And this is what it means when it says that. Those who are tied to the spiritual Adam are spiritual, just like those who are tied to the physical Adam are physical. And Paul says, you fools, don't you understand the difference between the one and the other is as vastly different as Adam was from Christ. One is physical, the other is spiritual. One has all of the problems of the physical, the other has all of the benefits of the spiritual. And so as we first begin to understand what are our resurrected bodies going to be like, this is the first thing I want you to understand. And it's the most important thing that you need to understand. Is in contrast to what we exist in now, our second body will be spiritual. It will be recreated from heaven. It won't be tied to the earth. And it won't suffer any of those earthly ties that we suffer under now. Which, as I said, what it means when the Bible says we will be conformed to the image of Christ. And Paul finishes up here real quick in verse 49 with this beautiful promise. As we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly man. There's your first lesson about your coming body. It's a spiritual body. And it will bear the image of the heavenly. And it will no longer bear the image of the earthly. It will be nothing like it. It won't want what the earthly wants. It won't be suffer with the weakness that our earthly bodies suffer with. It'll be timeless, yeah. It'll be ageless, yeah. It'll be pain-free, and all that's going to be awesome. But that's still not the most awesome part of that. The most awesome part about our coming bodies is they are tied completely to the image of the second Adam, the heavenly man, the one who descended from heaven and took on the form of a servant. As John says, who put on flesh and dwelt among us. That's the most important thing about your coming body. It's going to be entirely conformed to the image of Christ. And when we think of all the benefits that we like about our coming resurrected bodies, like the freedom from pain and freedom from age and freedom from hunger and thirst and anxiety and sleeplessness and all of these things that we so often hate that are tied to life of this earth, that is still not the most important part. Those are just the benefits of what it means to be connected completely to the heavenly body. And so lesson number one would be this. If you were to ask me, what are our bodies, what are our physical bodies going to be like when Christ raises us from the dead? I would say, well, first and foremost, you need to understand they're going to be spiritual bodies. And that makes them vastly different from the bodies we inhabit now. And just like the seeds of the field, we're going to go in one thing, come out a completely different thing. Not a new and improved version of the old thing. That's not what's going to happen. Never get that in your mind. What we are going to be raised to is completely different than what we have suffered under in every conceivable way. Because it's going to bear the image of the heavenly man. What does that mean? That's what we're going to see next week. We're going to look at Jesus after his resurrection, and you're going to get a lot of little snippets of what you can expect in your own resurrection. Right? He was here weeks and weeks and weeks after he was raised from the dead. And we see him do a lot of stuff in that resurrected body. And when we look at Jesus' post-resurrection experience, we start to get a really cool idea of what our post-resurrection experience will be like too. And that's what we'll see, Lord's will, beginning next week. Let's have